This episode is brought to you by A3, a CMMC cloud-based collaborative environment for an organization seeking certification, otherwise known as an OSC, to build CMMC packages and share with a marketplace of consultant RPOs and assessor C3PAOs. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of 123 CMMC. My name is Dana Mantilia, and I will be your host. And our guest today is Jeff Baldwin. And Jeff is a cybersecurity architect. So, Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about what you do?
Sure. So, as a cybersecurity architect, my background has kind of been in the security engineering world, which kind of deals with a lot of the NIST controls, so 853 RMF, 171, and I'm actually get into 161 a little bit too, which is this supply chain risk management one. But kind of my current role that I am in now is kind of working with the supply chain cybersecurity, so making sure that our supply chain is aware of CMMC. So and then educating internally so that all of our contract officers and internal supply chain folks are aware of the new requirements that are coming out with the DFARS rule change.
So that's a very good thing you just said. I'm always asking everybody, how are these government contractors finding out that this train is coming down the tracks right towards them? And so you're part of the communication with letting them know.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Now we have an answer. So you'd contact with the contract managers and tell them about this so that they have time to prepare. Because obviously this takes time to prepare for this. So how soon before they get a contract would you say you're reaching out to some of these contract managers before they have what they're going to do?
Yeah, so kind of the good news that we've had is that we've had some shift right with the schedule, because when it first got announced in like 2019, 2020, it was going to be like, whoa, we're doing it right now. So it seems like it's giving everybody a little bit more time to prepare, which is really good. So it's kind of whenever the DFAR 7021 clause comes in effect, that's really, you need to have that CMMC certification in place before contract award. But as you know, we don't have a lot of C3POs that are out there. I think we have 3 as of today that are been approved, but they're still waiting on things like the scoping guidance and other guidance from DoD before they actually start issuing those CMC certificates.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, now we know there's the answer to our question. Jeff is the voice of letting everyone know. All right. So today we are going to talk about NA markings, which is something people probably don't think is that big of a deal, but you're going to explain to us why it's more of a big deal than they probably think. Okay. So our first question is going to be, when should I mark something as NA in NIST 171 or CMMC?
Right. So in 171, it's a little more clear cut, because in this, the 7012 clause, they kind of describe what you should do if you have a non-applicable or a alternative security measure that you want to implement. And that kind of involves a process where you email the DoD CIO and you kind of outline that, and then you get that approval from them. And then once you've done that, then you can mark it not applicable. So before you do that, you shouldn't mark it not applicable.
Okay, so that kind of ties into, so our next question is going to be, how do I mark it? What does that mean? Like, do I take a pen out? How am I marking this NA?
Yeah, so as part of your preparing for the CMMC, you should be performing a self-assessment, kind of going through all of the assessment objectives. And that's kind of one thing that's worth mentioning, is that they have the assessment guides that they're free and online. You can go look at those and go through all those assessment objectives and kind of ask yourself, you can convert those into, like, how are you doing this, right? So one good thing to do is the CMMC is not prescriptive. It's not telling you how to do things. So it kind of gives you, here's kind of a high-level goal / requirement. It's up to you how you want to implement. So you can kind of implement that in a way that, the first kind of thing you want to do is say, how am I doing this, right? And then just document how you're doing it. That's one thing. That's a great place to start, right? And then the second step of that is where you might want to bring in like a consultant or somebody else, is kind of look at, is that valid? Does that meet the goal or the intent? Because really what you're trying to do is meet the intent of that kind of practice or control or something. But so that's kind of where you're marking the not applicable, is kind of that kind of self-test. And when you're going through your SSP and you're documenting this sort of thing, how are you documenting? Are you documenting it as satisfied and implemented in place, or is it something that's not applicable or scoped out from your kind of system level requirements?
And then maybe it's a good idea if, after you do the self-assessment, and then there's some stuff you're not really sure if it should be marked NA, when you do bring that consultant in, kind of go over all that just to make sure that there's not something that you're thinking really doesn't need to be applicable, and they're like, yes, it does, that kind of thing. So, all right.
Yes.
So you briefly just touched on this about notifying the DoD. So is this something that everybody knows that they're supposed to be doing?
Probably not. But
Yeah.
it's in the 7012, and it says you email. Actually, if you actually file the 7012, it says you email your contract officer, and then the contract officer then emails the DoD CIO. I think a lot of people skip that step and they just go straight to DoD CIO, and the DoD CIO hasn't yelled at them and say, "No, you're not allowed to talk to me." It's supposed to come from your contracts officer. When we get the scoping guidance from CMMC, they may change some of this, how they want to handle it, but that's kind of how we handle it in DO 171. Kind of how are we going to scope things out? And kind of going back to the last question a little bit, I think good guidance is don't mark it not applicable unless you have the DoD CIO approval. And then you actually take that approval, and that becomes a document in your SSP that you provide to your assessor and say, here's my not approval. Here's my my approval for not applicable. So kind of good guidance there is don't mark it not applicable unless you have that. You can, like I said before, answer how you do it. And then when you have a C3PO or an assessor that comes in, they may look at your implementation and say, oh, you should have marked this not applicable. And you go, oh, okay, thanks. So that's kind of a good way to do it, is let them tell you it's not applicable versus you saying it's not applicable, and then they have to argue, and then you have to prove it then. So make it so you don't have to prove it. So let somebody else say it's not applicable unless you actually go that formal route and get that formal documentation.
Can you give us an example of what this email would look like? Just a sample of something you would be saying to the contract manager in the email.
Yep. So you could mention what the requirement is, what, level, that identifier that it is, and then say what you want to do instead or why you're not applicable. It's like, I don't think this applies to me because I don't have any wireless in my system. So that's a good one, and we'll get to that in a second with the DoD assessment methodology.
Okay.
Because that's actually an example in that methodology that you can look up online.
And then do you think if they thought it was applicable that they may say, well, we think that it is?
Right. So,
okay. So the contract manager is going to then reach out to the DoD, and the DoD is going to be the one that's going to determine that they don't believe that it should be marked NA, and go back to the contract manager, and then the contract manager will go back to the contractor. Okay. All right. Just wondering the way that was going to flow. SteelRoot, a national leader in helping companies in the defense industrial base with CMMC preparation and federal cybersecurity regulations. Big or small, SteelRoot is here to help design, build, and manage IT. The SteelRoot reference architecture is a secure, cloud-native operating environment built on zero trust principles. SteelRoot also provides managed cybersecurity, IT, and virtual ISSO services. Visit steelroot.us for more information. Okay, what is the DoD methodology for NA?
Right, so this is kind of the DoD assessment methodology is kind of that in the DFARS clauses for 7019 and 7012, which is where you have to put in a SPRS score, but basically a self-assessment. That's where you put in the score into that system. It mentions that you have to use the DoD assessment methodology. So when you look at the DoD assessment methodology, and kind of going back to that last question, there's the wireless piece to it. So that's actually the example that they use for not applicable. So when you're looking at that, it says that for wireless, for example, you get your approval, then you include that in your SSP in your documentation that you have the approval for it to be not applicable. Then when it comes to scoring time, you change it from not applicable to implemented, which means you get the points for it. So for an SBR self-assessment, you can get 110 score. not applicable would count for points. So, but also in there, kind of the caution is that just because you're not applicable, that doesn't mean that you're not being assessed. So, like an assessor that comes in, or if you're doing your self-assessment, they would want to look to see that you have a policy that says we don't allow wireless. So there's an examination there. So I'm examining your policy, looking to make sure that you don't have wireless. And then I would actually look at your environment to make sure you don't have wireless, because there's that verification method. So when I'm doing a verification as an assessor, what I'm doing is I'm looking to say, all right, you've documented this way, and now I'm verifying that the documentation is true to the actual system.
And that's a very good point too, because you're going to want to have it in writing that it's not applicable, not just when somebody says, so what about this? And you go, oh, that doesn't apply to us. That's not applicable. They're going to want to see that you wrote down, meaning that you reviewed it and you touched base on it, that this is not applicable. So having it in writing is going to be important.
Yeah, and then we get to the point of documentation. So theoretically, people say for level 1 CMMC, you don't need documentation. It makes it a lot easier if you have it, right? So,
yeah.
And then for CMMC level 1, it's kind of that pared down 17 sort of requirements, a lot smaller. At that level, there's not a large expectation that you're having not applicables versus like a level 3, 4, and 5, that may be where you have more likely to have a not applicable sort of control that you're, or practice that you're working with.
And I do think I caution people with level 1, because anytime you're putting anything into practice, let's just any rules, any compliance, anything, typically it's a lot easier to implement it if you have it in writing. So first of all, you can share it with everybody, and everybody, it's not like, doesn't turn into the game telephone where the fifth person hears completely different message than initially started. Everybody has documentation showing this is what our new rule is. This is how we're going to implement it. So even though, it doesn't say it's required, it's definitely helpful, as it would be with anything else you're trying to implement. So that's a good thing. I'm glad you mentioned that. All right. So do you have any advice for us, for somebody who maybe has to get themselves CMMC certified?
Yep. So this is where I get a little crazy in my system engineering shows a little bit. So what I recommend you do is that you look at your assessment guide. So don't really look at the model too much. Look at the assessment guide, because it may seem straightforward. Practice sounds really straightforward. And then you look at the assessment objectives and you're like, oh, what are they talking about there? Why are they mentioning that there? So like one example that I like to bring up is that there's a practice for doing like a vulnerability assessment, or it's actually scanning your system for vulnerabilities, right? And your system and application. So scanning your application for vulnerabilities, right? One interpretation of that, which is kind of, if you worked in cybersecurity, is you kind of run your Nessus scan or other vulnerability scanner, and it kind of comes back and says, oh, your Adobe level is out of patch, right? So that's like, okay, so I just patched my application, I'm good to go. Then you go down in the assessment guide and the further discussions, and they start talking about static source code analysis of code that you produce. I'm like, okay, that's a little off from what that was originally talking about. There is a different practice that does get into that, so it's something that you do have to do either way, but it's, gets covered in a better practice. So kind of my guidance is kind of really look at those assessment objectives, and then what would be very helpful for you is then to kind of come up with, so here's the thing I got to do. I do it, but how do I test it? So think about, how can I test and verify that? So when you have your implementation, say, okay, I'm going to look at this document, or okay, for this one, I have it in my document, it's defined here, because a lot of the assessments will be like, has it been defined? So you define it in a document or a procedure or policy, wherever you want to define it, your SSP even. And then you have that procedure. So just kind of have that procedure to go through all those assessment objectives so that you can verify and test yourself. And the good thing about once you have those kind of written procedures, it's a ton of work, because there are 705 assessment objectives. That is a ton of work. But once you do it, it's good. So you don't have to do it again. And it becomes reusable. So if you want to, perform a self-assessment in a year from now, you already have the procedure to do that self-assessment. If you have somebody that new that starts with your company and you want to train them, you can give them the assessment procedures. It's already there. So it doesn't get, you don't get stuck with one, person with everything in their brain. So if that person leaves the company, you lose all that knowledge. So already having it there, it kind of gives you that reusability, and then also kind of make sure you have that traceability and kind of that, making sure that you're going through bullet by bullet, making sure you have all your I's and T's crossed. And that's really kind of help you be more successful in your CMMC assessment.
And another thing too with that is when they're going through the objectives is, get everything done that you understand. And then when you get to something that maybe it sounds too technical or whatever, instead of getting overwhelmed, just set that aside. And then maybe afterwards, that's when you meet with your IT person and you say, I don't even know what this means. They'll definitely understand it much more so than you will. And then you can deal with it then. Because when you try to start tackling too much at once, you get overwhelmed with this technical stuff that you don't even want to move forward doing anything. So go through and answer and what you can with the objectives, and just take note of those other ones that are a little bit tricky, and then go talk to the IT department. Just a good little stepping stone towards moving through the whole system as opposed to getting hung up.
And the good thing with that is that there is a lot of people that are content creators that are talking about these sort of things. So if you run into those issues on LinkedIn or whatever, people are very, very willing to help, free of charge. They just want to help and answer. Where it comes into problem is a lot of it's not authoritative, and a lot of it's sort of opinion based. So there is something called assessor discretion. So when you do have an assessor, when you finally have an assessor, each one of them may interpret things slightly different. So there's everything, again, it's not prescriptive. So really if I was your assessor, what I'd be coming in to say is that, have you satisfied the intent of this? So you don't get like an A++ score. It's a pass fail, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, did you meet some sort of threshold of bar to be enough to satisfy this, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody can interpret that a little bit different, where the bar is, and what kind of that. So there's some built-in mechanisms with that, with the lead assessor that kind of can overrule an assessor. So like if you have an assessor that fails you on an objective, the lead assessor can say, no, actually I think they're good on this one, and then change it to a pass. So it'll be interesting to see how it all works out in the end.
That's for sure. It's definitely going to be interesting to see how the pass fail works, because I get nervous with pass fail, because it is black or white. And somebody thinks, well, you're not doing it 100% black, then you don't pass, kind of thing. But that's good that you just said somebody could say, well, they're doing it enough to check the box, right? Okay, good. All right. Well, Jeff, thank you very, very much for your time. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and watching. And we hope to see you on the next episode. So take care.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
This episode is brought to you by A3, a CMMC cloud-based collaborative environment for an organization seeking certification, otherwise known as an OSC, to build CMMC packages and share with a marketplace of consultant RPOs and assessor C3PAOs.